Okay, so it looks like we've got a good number of attendees with us now. So while we just wait for the last few to connect, here's a quick reminder and rundown of what to expect on today's webinar. So we're excited today to be joined by Carl Clarke, the Sales and Marketing Director at Ecovision, who will be talking through everything you need to know to get started with selling solar. Plus, we'll also briefly touch on PPA, power purchase agreements, and answer any questions that you may have. The webinar is due to last around 45 minutes, starting with Carl's presentation before we move into the Q&A. And to help keep things flowing, we'll keep all the Q&A to the end of the presentation. So please submit as we go along, and others will have the opportunity to upvote in case we're short on time at the end. We'll do our very best to answer as many questions as we can. If we run out of time, we will ensure to follow up offline. This session is being recorded and we'll email a link to watch on demand, along with other resources mentioned and a summary of the presentation later this week. With that being said, without further ado, Carl, let me hand over to you to introduce yourself and take us through everything a broker needs to know about selling solar and the additional benefits of coming via OnlineDIRECT.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everybody. As Claire said, my name's Carl Clarke. I'm the Sales and Marketing Director for Ecovision. A little bit of background on myself. Been involved in the renewable space, EV charging, solar, biomass for the last 14 years. Ecovision itself as a business, established in 2010, based in Gloucester. We've completed around 5,500 installations, and we currently manage around 19,000 solar assets for portfolio owners, asset owners, schools, C&I sites directly. We've got around 25 engineers across the UK, so we offer national coverage. And I see us as slightly different in the marketplace, as we are sort of an O&M provider that offers installations. And what that means is that everything that we do, we're looking at the long term. So it's not just about putting panels on roof or on the ground, it's about how do we look after them? What's the design impacts? Do we need access? All of those factors for things like cleaning and maintenance. So we have a very different view than some of the people in the marketplace. So today is really going to be a bit of a high level view, covering sort of a bit of an introduction to myself as I've done, a little bit of an update around the market and the growth opportunity within solar. Give you some sort of high level stuff about how solar actually works and the benefits of solar for an organization, installation planning considerations, the financials, some examples of return on investments, and then commissions available, and then any questions at the end. So the market opportunity. So currently in the UK, we've installed about 17.5 gigawatts of solar. If you compare that to the target for 2030 of around 40 plus gigawatts, there's massive growth in the next 5 years. Solar is now the sort of lowest cost generation technology in the marketplace, very easy to deploy, and there's a massive growing demand for energy independence and sustainability. So why now? I'm not going to read through all of these, but obviously energy prices have increased. The rooftop solar can cut your bills by 30 to 70%. There's reduced restrictions on things like planning permission. It's providing great returns on investment with paybacks between, typically for a commercial site, between 3 and 7 years. The panels themselves, now the technology is improved, the efficiency of the panels is improved. They've got long-term warranties for 20 years and they'll continue working beyond that period. And obviously there's a big focus on decarbonisation in the UK, being sustainable and benefiting the planet. So how solar works. So essentially you have solar panels which are made up of solar cells, tampered glass, aluminium, and semiconductor materials. When the sunlight hits the solar, it essentially knocks the electrons loose from the atoms, and they travel through the solar panels, and they're classed as what we call DC current. What happens from there is it basically travels through the solar panels, whether that's 5, 10, 100, 200, and gets to a point where we go to an inverter. An inverter essentially converts it from DC to AC power so we can use it on site or in your home. It then basically travels and connects into your existing infrastructure. So whether that's your distribution board or in your house or in the business. How the solar works is as the solar is being produced, the solar electricity goes against the least current. So as the solar is being produced, it will automatically go to the site first. So if you've got the demand is in line with what the solar is producing, you'll just use the solar. If there's surplus, it will go out to the grid. And if you need more power, it will automatically import the difference. So you're always continuously using the solar first for your appliances, your business, your manufacturing, whatever your office block, and then you can export. If you export, there is incentives, which I'll talk through later in the presentation. And obviously now in the last few years, there's been the emergence of battery storage. So it's then a case of, instead of exporting to the grid, can we store that power? Can we use that power later on to do things like peak shifting or for nighttime demand? And there's multiple of new income streams coming available in the battery market for ancillary services, balancing, wholesale. So when you're looking at an installation or looking at one of your clients, there's a few key things to consider. At Ecovision, we will do a full feasibility. We can do a desktop assessment, and we can help and give you some training and guidance on what you can look for yourselves when you're talking to a client. So the types of installations typically are rooftop, which can be flat or pitch roofs, ground mounts or carports, and typically behind the meter will be with your clients. The solar parks are direct connections to the infrastructure and very different. So we're looking at all things behind the meter where the benefit of the business or the organization can utilize the solar. The key considerations when we're looking at a project is obviously site surveys, grid connection, safe system design, and premium components. So roof considerations. So the amount of solar generated is determined by obviously the roof space available. It determines the capacity. Larger areas of roof space will have larger capacity for installations and allowing things like maintenance channels and access. The different types of roof materials we can work on now, pretty much most scenarios. So your typical flat roofs, metal roofs, fiber cement roofs for farming, agricultural. You can do stuff on tiles. So there is a multitude of rooftop solutions now available, and the same for the ground. You've got you can do low ballast systems. You can do traditional ground mount, which you might see in solar parks. And now, obviously, what's happening in the last couple of years is really the growing of carport canopies, where businesses might not have suitable roof space, but actually have got a car park. So integrating a car solar canopy and potentially with EV charging. When we look at a roof, one of the key considerations is the structural integrity. Obviously, there's quite a lot of load going on. Solar panels, typically, we work on about 25 kilo per square meter. That load goes on, and then you combine that with needing to do the wind load uploads, depending on where you are in the country, and also snow loads. So when we get snow, obviously that additional weight on top of the panels, and that's a service that all systems in the UK doing rooftops should be going through and getting a formal structural assessment confirmed and completed. Sometimes there's the odd building that may need some reinforcement, or we have to look at more of a sort of low ballast system or sort of a low weight system. So there's panels out there that are a lot lighter. There's mounting systems that are a lot lighter. So depending on the results of that structural assessment will determine if there needs to be a change of design. So when sort of looking at solar panels, I think traditionally it's always been we need to put solar panels on south-facing buildings. In the commercial world, particularly, it's been more acceptable to look at alternatives because typically they are more shallow pitches than your traditional domestic properties that are sort of 35, 40 degree pitches. The optimal, though, is sort of 10 to 35 degrees south-facing. Over the years now, the industry has realised that particularly in the commercial space where, you've got shallow pitch roofs of 5, 10, 15 degrees, you can actually, and it is effectively efficient to have systems on the east-west. And what that tends to do is it gives you a slightly different bell curve. So instead of a south-facing building where you might have a peak around midday, east and west will have a sort of more of a slower curve, which means you sort of generate slightly less, but you generate slightly more power at different times of the day. So again, depending on the business, depends on when they need the power and when their utilization is, that actually can be a benefit. Also found that, when you are doing larger scale and there is a big demand, even putting stuff on the north facing side of a shallow pitch can still be a benefit to that particular client. Again, it needs to be modeled and designed, but if you've got the usage and as you do an installation, you get the cost price down, it sometimes does make sense. Other factors, so geographical locations will determine the solar radiation. So obviously in the south of the UK, we get more sunlight than we do in the north. And obviously vice versa with wind, they get more wind in the north and we get less in the south. So you traditionally see that there is a little bit of a transition between the two technologies. Other things to consider are things like shading analysis. So looking at trees, skylights, neighboring buildings, and then obviously that needs to optimize design. There is things that you can install to minimize and improve shading analysis. So if you've got particular properties that have, a guaranteed, there's a flue, and we know that flue is going to impact with the system every single day. There's obviously a design element to move it around from the shaded area, but you can also use what we call optimizers or microinverters, where each panel runs independently. What traditional solar panels are is you put them in strings. So you might have 20 panels in a string. And what happens is if a bit of shading goes onto that string, it affects the whole of that string. With microinverters, if the shading goes onto that one panel, it only affects that one panel. And as the shading moves throughout the day, it would only affect the panels it's shading. So again, longer term, if you've got sort of a building or an area that's continuously in shade, then that's probably the design solution to discuss. Other sort of requirements are planning permission. So now most systems now under 1 megawatt can be done under permitted development, unless you are in a conservation area or listed or ground mount, which means that you can sort of still need to do in some regions, put a sort of permitted development application in, but you don't need to go for a full plan application. Next thing to consider is obviously the grid connection. So every system on a 3-phase, which is commercial, over 11 kilowatts, we need to do a pre-application to the local network operator. So essentially, we send an application saying we want to connect this system on this building, on this MPAN, and then they will do a network study. What they're assessing for is the local infrastructure can support that. The way they look at it is assuming that there's no power consumed on site. All of that solar is going to go into the network. Can the network cope with it? They typically take between 4 and 12 weeks, depending on the size system. Larger systems can take longer if they need big HV impact studies. But your traditional sort of smaller scale, your 10 to 500 kilowatts is normally within that 4 to 12 weeks. And then your export capability. So when you do get a grid connection back, sometimes they may put export limitations on there. So it's like you can connect that size system, but you can only export so much. Again, there is technologies out there that we can factor in. So do you utilize battery storage and take the surplus? Or you can put what we call export limitation on. So when it hits the export limit at a certain peak of the day or time of the year, it will just restrict the system down to the levels. It just gives more flexibility for the clients rather than having to reduce the size of the system. And then the other consideration, as I mentioned before, is around long-term access and maintenance. I think historically the industry is focused on putting panels on roofs, and now we're finding that there's a more focus on what's the long-term OPEX and maintenance of the system. So ensuring that there is, things like access ladders. If you look at the latest regulations around maintenance, they want you to be going off on the roof. They want you to be checking the connections. They want you to be doing torque tests on the mounting system. And to do that, you need access. So part of the installation is advising around, is there safe systems on the roof? Do we need permanent edge protection? Do we need access ladders for ongoing maintenance, even sort of cleaning the panels? So harnessing advanced solar. So obviously the market is and the industry is evolving. We now have panels of 650 watts. When I joined in 2010, it was like 190, 200. So you're now getting more out of your roof space. Inverters have got smarter with monitoring and fault alerts. Obviously, the emergence of battery storage and linking those up now, where you can store your surplus energy and discharge it to benefit the client at different times or at night. And then smart integration is evolving with further technologies. So solar delivers sort of financial return. So typically we're seeing in the commercial space 20 plus return on percent return on investment. Average is around 5-year payback, reducing customers' bills by sort of 70%. And then you've got income generation through export or through the emergence of the new tariffs and schemes around battery storage. So making solar a bit more accessible. So obviously I've mentioned you've got the smart export guarantee seg rate. So all the energy companies offer this. But you also have some companies, and Claire will talk about later, that can offer export PPAs for clients who have larger surplus to export. From a company's perspective, there's potential tax reliefs. Obviously, you reduce your carbon footprint and you green your green credentials. And obviously, there's the regulatory stuff that needs to happen within the system to make it perform and have less warranty and maintenance claims. So different ways to fund. So you've got traditional CapEx, customer funded. So they want a system. There's a cost to that system, and they fund it through their own funds. And then potentially, depending on that, they may have advanced capital allowances and tax benefits. Benefit there is they own the system from day one, and they enjoy all the benefits of export and savings. Next option is to look at asset finance. So essentially works from from our perspective, it's a CapEx. There's no upfront payment for the client, and they can just spread the costs of the investment over a period, typically between 1 and 5 years. We see most agreements between 3 and 7. And obviously, again, there's some tax benefits, there's cash flow benefits. You get immediate savings. They still own the system from day one. Or you've now got sort of PPA and leasing. So this is where a customer doesn't want to invest any money into solar, but wants to benefit. So there's zero upfront costs. The funder will pay for the whole installation and maintenance for the 20-25 year period. They will give you a fixed discount rate on your electricity. So particularly a client might be paying 25p, they might offer a PPA of 12p. So for every kilowatt hour that client uses of the solar, they are making a 13p saving. They will do the full design, install, maintenance and compliance, so the client's got no liabilities. And obviously it just gives them long-term savings without having to purchase. Look, with our PPA provider, there is a buyout option as well. So if the client in 2 years' time, 3 years' time wants to buy the system, there is an option. So a typical sort of CapEx example, so a 250 kilowatt system in Bristol would generate you around 225,000 kilowatt hours in year one. If we assume the customers consume 70% of that at 20p, exports the remaining 30% at 5p, and the CapEx cost of the installation ex-VAT is 150,000 with ongoing OPEX costs of 1,500. So the revenue for the savings would be 31,000. The export revenue would be 3,375. That would give them an internal rate of return of 28% and a payback year in 5 years. So commission. So any partner that brings us a proposition for a PPA, we pay a upfront payment of £40 per kilowatt. That can rise to £60 per kilowatt depending on the project. So a typical 400 kilowatt system, there would be an upfront payment to the broker of £16,000. In addition to that, you also benefit from the long-term revenue opportunities, which are index linked. We will give you a PPA revenue share of 0.3p for every generated for what's been generated on site. So typically, the 250 kilowatt system generates 157,500 annually. This equates to £472 a year, which over the lifetime of the scheme gives you another income stream of £11,812. On top of that, you also get 10% of the ongoing maintenance fees. So if you look at that again over that 25-year period, that's an additional 5,000. So the total earnings from recommending a 250 kilowatt project could be an £10,000 upfront cost, additional £11,812 of PPA share, and then £5,000 of O&M fees. So one project could generate you as a broker £26,812. And then obviously you've got clients who CapEx, slightly different because there's obviously no long-term revenue involved in this project. So there's a sliding scale based on the CapEx cost. So a client that wants a small system that's cost 30,000, then you would get a 9% commission, which is £2,700. And that scales down to size. And then once you go 500 kilowatts, 500,000 upwards, then there's a custom calculation. Plus you still get the ongoing 10% of the maintenance fees. So obviously solar is strategically to meet ESG investment. It demonstrates sustainability. We're finding that lots of clients, lots of businesses are looking at their supply chain now and asking around, what are you doing around sustainability? What are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? Obviously, we've got net zero targets that everybody's aiming to achieve. It future-proofs us and makes us more reliant around cost of energy as we get more and more adoption of solar. And it sort of gives you stakeholder trust, advanced client, investor, and staff relationships. I think we're now on to Q&As.
All right, thanks, Carl. That was a really brilliant presentation there, really informative. As you said, we're going to go into the Q&A now, and we've got quite a few questions sent through. So we'll start with those, and that gives a little bit more time for anyone else to post additional questions that you may have off the back of Carl's presentation. Okay, so have a little look through. Okay, so we have a question from Matthew. Who is billing the client for the PPA? Is it Ecovision or another funder? Also, is the 0.3p per kilowatt based on generation or usage?
So the PPA funder is a well-known organisation we work with. They will fund the project. We would be the installer and the maintenance provider during that period. And the 3p is based on their generation. So whatever the system generates, whether it's exported to the grid or used on site.
Right, I want to start from the bottom. Okay, so Rashid, as somebody brand new to this, what advice do you have in regards to prospects, common pain points, how to win deals amongst the competition?
I think the common ones are obviously it's always been the funding, but we've found over the last several years that there is now different funding options, like you say, PPA, asset finance, CapEx. So that does sort of reduce the barriers to market and give clients of sort of all financial standings the opportunity to get involved in solar. I think it's just making sure that you obviously work with reputable partners, and there's a robust feasibility and design process. We're happy as Ecovision to get involved in any part of the process, whether that's a call with the customers just to give them some basic understanding of how solar works, whether you want this involved in the proposition. We work with OnlineDIRECT, and we're happy to support you as a broker and them as a business in helping your customers adopt solar.
Okay, that's great. So Rashid, if you ever find that you're having any trouble, like we're here to help you through anything. You can come to us. Obviously, we've got Carl that can assist you with anything that you're finding a bit of an issue. Okay, government grants. Nothing really available at the moment, is there, Carl?
No, there's some government funding around for a certain public sector. There is some funding around more sort of local level, more so sort of targeted at the residential market with like warm homes and Eco4. Obviously, you've got the export seg rate and the export tariff, and obviously there is VAT and tax benefits. But the schemes like the old feed-in tariff from sort of 2020 don't exist at the moment. But I guess as we get closer to our net zero targets, there may be more funding and grants become available to help incentivize customers and businesses to adopt solar.
Yeah, well, we'll keep our eyes open for them as well. PPA earning potential. You've gone through that bit already. So if you need
so
to,
obviously
Matthew,
you've got
yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Claire. Yeah, so for that, you've got the upfront payment, which we've got a sliding scale, and then you've got the ongoing revenue through the PPA share.
Okay. Salim, regarding the options of self-funding and PPA, what are the minimum sizes of array that are worthwhile, and what are the current export rates / terms available?
So typical PPA funders want as large a system as they can get. Our funder typically starts at about 150 kilowatts. They can do smaller, just the PPA rate is just less attractive. But they will also do multiple systems. So if you have a client that's got 7 sites across the UK, they would aggregate that as one complete project. So it might be that you have, for example, I don't know, a care home that's got 8 sites, and each site can do 50 kilowatts, then they would definitely look at that. But traditionally, the bigger you go, the better the PPA rate can be, because the cost of installation is one of the big drivers. And obviously, the bigger you go, the cost of installation comes down, which gives them more flexibility to offer better rates. But I wouldn't discount anything. If you find that you've got a client that's interested in going through the journey, and what we tend to find is we get lots of clients who start going down the PPA route. They then realise that, what's the returns involved, and then they either capex or they go down the asset finance route themselves.
Yeah, so lots of options available. Okay, Ian has a question. How do I arrange export contracts, and do they pay commission?
So your traditional seg rate is fixed by the energy company. So that's normally down to the client to approach their import supplier and say, I've put in solar on, can I get a seg rate, and what does that look like? I know, Claire, you've got companies that do offer export PPAs. So you're probably better positioned to discuss that directly with anybody who's got a question.
Yeah, Ian, if your client is looking to export, I can do some bespoke export contracts. You can come to me for that. The people we work with, they do typically require a minimum of a generation of 30,000 kilowatts to be exported back. So anything less than that, I would advise to go down SEG, Smart Export Guarantee. Otherwise, it won't really be looked at. It'll be too low. Right, next question, Sue. Okay, we currently have a considerable number of clients with solar panels who would like contracts to sell back to the grid. Oh, I have just come out of that. Bear with me. What happened?
So I think this probably mirrors the question before, that potentially the clients can go to their energy company and get a seg.
Oh, yeah, I think it was
come and
basically
speak
what
to
I just
Claire and
answered.
see if the PPA funders would look at some sort of aggregated collectively sort of proposition.
Yeah, it says, I'm continually told this is not possible or not economical. Yeah, so like Carl just said, we've mentioned before, if they are not generating that much or exporting that much, it's better to go down seg, because it's not really worthwhile selling back. They won't get much back for it.
It also
Yeah.
depends on economic. There is a cost for an export meter and managing that export meter. So if the client isn't exporting enough to cover those costs, then it does sometimes make sense not to bother with export.
Yeah. Okay. Thomas, further information on connections for homes and business sites, the time period, and if planning permission is required, etc., and cost.
So as I mentioned, so any sort of site under 1 megawatt, unless you're sort of in the conservation area, listed building, doesn't need planning. It's done under permit development. Obviously, if it's a ground mount or carport, it does need planning. Typically, it's a 12-week process, like any other planning application. The DNO side, as I said, anything over 11 kilowatts on a three-phase, we need to do permission. They have got a fast track system, so for smaller systems, it typically 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the DNO. But they do have up to 45 working days to reply to response. If it's on a HV and it needs a HV network, then that can take longer. We always say to clients that typically from sort of the time they sort of decide they want solar, go through the sort of surveys, get proposals, confirm, and then go through the process, you're typically looking at 6 to 8 months to get to site or completion.
Okay. Right. Question from Rob: is there a minimum size that you will install?
No, no, typically, obviously, residential, we only do commercial. So we are looking typically from sort of 10 kilowatts upwards.
Right. Okay. Question from Rashid: can you name a few business sectors to target, which sits in the middle of competition level? And as a beginner, easier wins would be motivating and gather experiences.
So I guess high energy users is typically going to be going to give the end client the best return on investment. If you're not using the power and you're planning to export a lot, then yes, there is still a return, but it's better to use as much of the solar energy that you're generating. And we typically, when we do an assessment, we will get half hourly data, and then we'll look at what is the optimal system with and without battery storage for that particular client. And it's not always about filling the roof. It's about just making sure that we can give them the best conversion for their money and obviously the best return on investment. Obviously, there's things to think about future proofing. So if their energy demand is going to increase in the future, they're going to expand, then yes, then maybe when you're doing the solar, you might take those into consideration. But yeah, we want to try and nowadays is try and design a system to meet their energy demands.
Just off the back of Rashid's question, is there any sort of sectors that you think would be sort of better targeted?
Yeah, so what we tend to find at the moment is manufacturing, logistics, agricultural all seem to be on the forefront. But then they tend to have the right roof space. They tend to be, the farming agricultural is very much, used to subsidies, used to that type of environment. But yeah, warehousing, you tend to have big roofs. Manufacturing, you have big demands. But obviously, particularly, and ultimately with solar, any type of business with a roof can adopt solar. It's just what's viable. Sometimes, the roof might not be viable, but is there a bit of land or is there a car park? So I don't think we need to necessarily pigeonhole and say that's the right sector. I think we want to get everybody adopting solar and all becoming part of the microgrid and the network and hitting our net zero goals.
Okay, good. Okay, we have one from Rob. If after prospecting a buy-in from a potential client, what's the ongoing involvement from the broker?
It's really entirely up to you. If you've got the relationship with the client, then I would say you stay in that process. or you can just completely hands off and pass over the inquiry, and then we'll manage it completely end to end.
Yeah, that's what I always promote as well. I've spoken to a few of you brokers before. You know, you can be involved as much as you want, or you can hand it over to me and, you know, I'll communicate with Carl. Like Carl said earlier, Ecovision are really happy to contact the customer. So it's really up to you. Question from Matthew. What do you need to be able to price up a system and provide cost analysis for the customer? Also understand earning potential for us.
So typically nowadays with technology, we can do a lot desktop. So normally I'd say is if we've got the location of the building, and we've got half-hourly data or some analysis around their consumption, we can make a pretty accurate sort of cost for this system. Obviously, it gets firmed up when we get to site and, can't know exactly what the cable route is or what we're connecting into. But, we've got enough experience now to know that we're only going to be a few percent difference. So yeah, if you've got a site plan, half-hourly data, ideally, we can give you a desktop analysis that will give you everything you'll need to propose that back to a client in that initial stage.
Yeah, anything you need, you can email me directly and I'll provide you with more information, what is required to enable Ecovision to provide you a quote. Anthony, what is the minimum and maximum returns depending on the kilowatt panel installed?
Isn't really a minimum maximum return. It's really case by case. It really comes down to, what they're paying for their energy, how much they're consuming, and the cost of installation, how technical it needs to be, or how complex. If it's a relatively cost-effective solution because it's, a metal roof, it's south-facing, it's easy access, scaffold is very straightforward, then the returns can be expected to be 3 years if they're using the majority of the power. If it's a complex, it's on multiple roofs, it's a complex scaffold, and the cost of installation is a lot higher, then expect those returns to take longer and payback periods take longer.
Yeah, every project's going to be different, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, Rashid again. Given UK sunshines, people don't seem very interested in solar panels. How do we tackle those?
I'd probably say that's probably not the case. I think we're seeing a trend of people moving towards solar. There's 1.5 million homes now with solar. The new build now is an announcement that all new builds have to have solar from I think 2027. We are finding that they just general adoption of renewable technologies. People are sort of now adopting as part of their culture. And I think obviously as we get closer to targets, not that businesses will be forced into it, but I think there's pressure on, like I said earlier, the supply chains. We've got clients now that are really asking around sustainability goals, and supply chain needs to be doing their part as part of their SSG.
Yeah, I think if people don't seem that interested, they probably don't know enough. So I guess it's about the education.
Yeah, and with the funding options now, it's not even, those barriers have been reduced, so, they might not be in a financial position to put £200,000 of solar on the roof, but they could go down the PPA route and suddenly make £10,000, £12,000 worth of savings a year with no investment.
Yeah, no brainer. Okay, don't think there's any more questions. Any more questions from anybody? Okay. Right, okay, so with that being said, it looks like we're out of questions for today. So unless anyone has anything else, any more questions, we'll look to end there. If you do have any further questions, of course, you can find further information on our website or get in touch with me by emailing energyservices@onlinedirect.co.uk. For now, thank you to everyone who's joined us live today, and to Carl, of course, for sharing such useful insights. Keep your eyes on your inboxes for the recording, links to other resources and answers to any additional questions that we didn't manage to answer. We hope that you can join us again for another OnlineDIRECT webinar very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.